Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Today we continue my Druid series. I created this series to highlight the Druid spell list, which I often find underrated or oversimplified. In this series I've covered cantrips and all spell levels of up to 6th level spells, and today we're going to be covering 7th level spells. Up to this point, there have been several spells spanning all levels that I think are top tier spells. Sometimes they're summoning or healing, but often battlefield controls. Many other spells are still good spells and worthy of preparation and casting. Now that we're heading into 7th and 8th level spells, I need to say, these aren't our best levels for the Druid. Druids certainly aren't alone in struggling with spells at these levels, but I definitely wouldn't consider Druid top spellcasters when it comes to 7th and 8th level spells. Still, if we're pushing for those amazing 9th level spells, we still want to pick our best options here. And it's not like we don't have any good options. Probably the biggest challenge here is that the Druid spell lists for level 7 and 8 are just really small. Today we'll be covering a total of 7 spells. Next time it'll be only 8. Just to compare, with 6th level spells we had 17 options. So naturally there's going to be less top spells. The spell symbol was added to the 7th level Druid spell list as an optional class feature in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. So I will be covering it in today's video, but just be aware that if you aren't playing with these optional class features, you're not going to find this spell on the Druid spell list. If you like this content and you are interested in supporting this channel, you can do so through Patreon. There is a link to my Patreon in the video description, and patrons of this channel get rewards like they can see these videos early, and they can see them without YouTube ads. My top level patrons can join me and play some Dungeons & Dragons every month, and I would like to thank these top level patrons today: Airhead, Alex Quendo Vang, Alexander Baldwin, Alexander Razin, Rob Reichelt, Aurelio Christian, Awesome Face, Ben Potts, Benjamin, Black, and Bloody Nine. Thank you all for your continued support. Let's get started. I will be using my standard rating system for these spells. If I rank a spell as red, that means I'm not recommending the spell. The spell may just be a bad spell, or it may just not be good enough for the level for me to recommend. If I rank a spell as orange, I think it's overly circumstantial. It's probably useful some of the time if you know those circumstances are going to come up. But if you're not, I wouldn't normally probably prepare it. A purple spell, I think, is just fine. It generally does what it should do, and I think it's a reasonable preparation for the level. If I rank a spell as green, I'm saying it is a good spell. I think that green spells are above average, and I recommend them for preparation. And if I rank a spell as blue, I'm basically saying it's pretty much a must-have. I mean, these are the best spells in the game, and you want to grab them whenever you can. If you are colorblind, I include stars to make it easier for you to see. So if I rank a spell as red, I'll give it 1 star. If I rank it as orange, 2, purple, 3, green, 4, and blue, 5. I'll also announce the rating of every spell, so if you're just listening, you're set. Our first spell is Firestorm. This is a 1-action cast that creates 10-foot cubes of fire within 150 feet. We can create up to 10 cubes, and we can place them however we want, as long as they're adjacent to each other. Each creature in a cube must make a dexterity saving throw, taking 7d10 fire damage, or 38.5 on average on a failed saving throw, or half as much on a successful save. This ignites flammable objects that are unattended and damages objects in the area, though we can exclude plant life. Now, our last single action non-concentration blast spell was Cone of Cold. That spell was 5th level. And you know what? The damage was pretty close to the same. That's like 2 full spell levels ago, like 4 character levels, and we're doing about the same damage. Now, Firestorm has the advantage that we can shape it, so we can theoretically hit more enemies while avoiding allies. Also, we have a range advantage. But are those 2 things alone worth 2 spell levels, we're going to be 13th level when we access this spell. Even a CR 13 creature is going to have somewhere in the range of 260 hit points. So we're going to hit them with 38.5 save for half. So I would expect about a 10% hit point loss with our highest level spell. So yeah, I like some of the things about this spell. The range is good, the shape ability is nice, but the damage probably just isn't high enough for this level, and there's nothing but damage. Chain Lightning is a 6th level spell, though as a druid we don't get it. But it has the same range, can avoid friendly fire, and it's doing 45 points of damage on average, and it is a lower level spell. So I'm really not sure what happened here. It's just too low damage to recommend considering the spell level. So unfortunately I need to rank it red. Obviously these kinds of blasts haven't been our strength at any level, but we've dipped to the point I don't think I would bother. Our next spell is Mirage Arcane. The Druid casts Mirage Arcane over 10 minutes over an area of up to 1 square mile that they can see. The terrain in the area is altered to look, smell, sound, and feel like some other kind of terrain. Structures in sight as well can be altered in the same way, or structures could be added to the illusion. The illusion lasts for 10 days, no concentration required. Creatures in the area cannot be disguised by the spell, nor can you add illusionary creatures. Any piece of illusionary terrain that is moved from the spell's area disappears. Because the illusion, unlike most illusions, has a tactile element, you can use the illusion to create terrain that impedes movement, such as difficult terrain. Likewise, a creature can interact with the terrain, so an illusionary rock could be lifted and thrown, for example. Any creature with true sight can see through the illusion, but they can still physically interact with any aspects of it. The wording that they can interact with it suggests that it's a choice. So presumably, a creature with true sight could climb an illusionary wall, or walk right through it, as they choose. This could lead to some interesting combinations for a PC under the effects of the true sight spell. Now, that's how the spell is written, but I should note it contradicts itself. For example, it specifically says that the terrain's general shape remains the same, but it also specifically says you can change a precipice to a gentle slope. So apparently there is at least some leniency in regards to what is meant by general shape, since a gentle slope and a cliff are very different shapes. Presumably, if a natural cliff drops 500 feet, a Mirage Arcane could create a slope, but I guess that would need to eventually drop that 500 feet. As for how big a structure that you can create can be before it alters the general shape of the terrain is not included in the spell description. So I guess that lands in the lap of your DM, as a lot of things about this spell do. According to the designers, you can climb an illusionary tree or fall off an illusionary cliff, and thus taking damage. And that suggests that the tactile part of the illusion is real to the extent that it can actually be used to facilitate movement where you couldn't without the aid of an illusion, and the possibility of damaging a creature with illusionary effects is also possible. So there's a whole lot about this spell that is left up to the DM. One thing the spell specifies is you cannot conceal a creature with a spell. So presumably that means the spell can't conceal creatures with walls, trees, or anything. So that's a pretty significant limit. But what about after the spell's been cast? So if there's an illusionary tree, can I hide behind the tree? Well, I can only say how I would run the spell because it's going to differ from DM to DM. Personally, I would say that you can't conceal a creature when the spell is cast, but illusionary effects should be able to conceal creatures afterwards. Furthermore, I read this as an illusion. The spell specifically states that it is an illusion that includes audible, visual, tactile, and olfactory elements. An illusion is something that is tricking your senses. So, if you create an illusionary seawall, presumably it wouldn't prevent flooding, since the water doesn't have a sense of touch to fool. So, an illusion that tricks your sense of touch might stop you, but not the water. But a DM could just consider illusionary aspects completely real within the area of this spell. It really depends on your DM, so I can only rate this spell based on how I interpret it. And based on how I would run it, there is a lot you can do with this. It's obviously out of combat with a 10-minute casting time, but the utility of the spell is nearly limitless. Or if you have a chance to prepare this before a combat, it could create defenses that would have a massive impact on a battle. So I think my rating here is purple. The casting time is a significant limitation, but an illusion, especially of this scope, that impacts your sense of touch as well as your other senses, is dramatic. Next up, plane shift. This requires an action to cast from our druid, and they, as well as up to 8 other creatures that are touching, can transport themselves to another plane of existence. When you cast this, you can also specify the destination on the plane of existence you wish to be transported to. The location is specified in general terms, so you can transport to a particular building on that other plane, and then the spell will have you appear either at or near that destination. You can combine the spell with existing teleportation circles you know on the plane you're transported to. So if you do that, then you can appear exactly in the location where the circle is, allowing for a greater degree of precision. Alternatively, you can use this to banish an unwilling creature to another plane of existence. If you do that, you need to make a melee spell attack against that creature, and then, if you hit, it gets a charisma saving throw to avoid being transported. If it fails, it's transported to a random location on the plane you specified, no duration, no concentration, so unless it has planar teleportation abilities, it's basically gone. The spell requires a material component of a tuning fork worth at least 250 gold pieces attuned to a particular plane of existence that is not consumed by the spell. Although it's not specifically said in the spell's description, presumably that component will only allow the spell to transport to the specific plane of existence for which the fork is attuned. So if you had a tuning fork attuned to the ethereal plane, then the ethereal plane would be open for the spell, but you couldn't use that same fork to transport to the elemental plane of fire. Okay, so this spell requires that tuning fork, and I can't say how difficult that will be to acquire in any given campaign. But presuming you can acquire the component for the spell, this is a good spell. One tuning fork you will definitely want for this spell is one attuned to your native plane of existence, or there's no way back. So there are multiple uses for the spell. First, you could use it as an emergency escape. So, let's say you have a fork attuned to the Feywild. You could, as an action, transport yourself and your entire party to anywhere in the Feywild to escape an overwhelming enemy or other hazard in one action. Secondly, you could use it for straight-out teleportation. So, let's say you're in Chult and you want to get back to the Sword Coast. You could use one casting to transport to the Feywild, then another casting to appear near your home in the Sword Coast. Thirdly, you can use this as a no concentration banishment. The attack roll is required, and there is a saving throw. So I think you need to decide if that's really worth your 7th level slot. I'm not sure I would use this option very often personally. But here it is. The Druid has gotten their first decent teleportation spell. You need to acquire the material components, and once you do so, you can now teleport with the entire party as an action. That can be really useful. I am rating this green. This is a big addition to what we can do as a druid, and teleportation comes up in gameplay fairly often. Our next spell is Regenerate. We cast this over 1 minute and touch a creature. That creature regains 48 plus 15 hit points, or about 33 hit points. And for the next hour, the creature regains 1 hit point at the start of each of their turns, so potentially up to 600 hit points. In addition, any severed body parts are restored after 2 minutes, or if the body part is available, you can reattach it instantly. So this spell basically contains 3 features. Let's look at each of them. First, the 48 plus 15 in healing. So that's 33 hit points of healing with a 1 minute casting to a single target, and that's nothing. I mean, if this was a low level spell, it would be something, but as a 7th level spell, it is not. Aura Vitality provides about 70 hit points over a minute, and that's a 3rd level spell, and it's providing twice as much healing. Second, you get 1 hit point back per turn. This is of moderate value. I mean, in combat, 1 hit point per round, again, really isn't anything unless you go down. I mean, if you go down to 0 hit points, 1 hit point gets you back up again. Also, let's say a party member under the effect of this needs to heal about 100 hit points between fights. Well, then 10 minutes of resting and they're back to full. So there's that. Though whether in between combat healing is worth a 7th level spell, I think is pretty questionable. Finally, the severed limbs. If you need to reattach a severed limb, this is the spell you need. Though technically speaking, the basic rules have no mechanics for limbs being severed in the first place. You can take hundreds of points of damage, and there is nothing saying you lose any body parts. Now, the Dungeon Master's Guide in Chapter 9 does include optional rules for lingering injuries, and those can include severed limbs. So if you are playing with those optional rules, and generally I don't find that tables do that, but if yours does, then this spell does have greater value. For the purposes of this rating, I'm assuming we're playing without that optional rule. So assuming severed limbs isn't a thing, that part of the spell is basically useless. The first part of the spell is not really significant either because it's just such a small amount for a full minute of casting. So really, it's about the value of 1 hit point per round. For the most part, I would say in between combat healing should be accomplished without needing to expend 7th level slots. As a druid, we have good healing options. As I said, Aura Vitality can get you 70 hit points, and we can split that up if we need to, and it's just a 3rd level spell. Good Berry heals 10 hit points per casting, and that's a 1st level spell. If someone goes down in combat, getting them that 1 hit point to get back up again usually isn't a big problem. Now, I'm not saying this doesn't have value, but a 7th level spell slot is a big expenditure, and I'm just not seeing enough here to justify that kind of investment. I'm not even of the opinion that this spell is the best healing option we have, even if we ignore the spell level. So I'm rating this red, as in I don't recommend it for preparation. Though if you're playing with lingering injuries, then it's probably orange. And if you do take it, it's likely not going to be worthless, but you're just not going to get 7th level spells worth of value, in my opinion. Next up is Reverse Gravity. As an action, our druid casts this and selects a point up to 100 feet away. Centered on that point, a 50-foot radius, 100-foot high area has gravity reversed for up to 1 minute using our concentration. Creatures and objects in the area that aren't secured to the ground fall upwards to the top of the area of the spell. If there is a ceiling somewhere before that, then they fall into the ceiling, taking falling damage as if they fell downwards, and they fall prone. If a creature on the ground has a fixed object they can grab within their reach, then they can make a dexterity saving throw to try to grab onto the object, thus avoiding the fall. So, by the wording of the spell, if there is no fixed object in reach to grab onto, then they get no saving throw. Once the spell ends, any creatures or objects in the area fall back down again as normal. So first thing, a flying creature in the area presumably can still fly, so this likely won't work on them at all. A DM might rule otherwise because realistically suddenly reversing gravity is probably going to cause some issues unless that creature has hover, but at least I would assume a reduced effect. Secondly, although there is a saving throw, a successful save here is not negating the effect. The saving throw is to grab onto something to avoid the fall. So presumably a non-flying creature that makes their save is holding onto something, like hanging upside down in the area. So that's going to cause some issues regarding moving or doing anything that requires the hand that's holding onto the object. The area of this spell is massive. A 50-foot radius cylinder is 100 feet across, and it spreads from the point you targeted. So there may be some issues using this inside, since the point you target needs to not be under full cover, and it will be the center of the effect. So in a 50-foot room, you're going to put yourself and your party in the effect. Not a problem likely if you can all fly, but it is something to consider. Also, as a druid, our spells up to now have largely been centered on dealing with enemies that can't fly. This is another one of those spells. But for dealing with those enemies, this is really good. I mean, this can be a mass 100-foot levitate with no save for huge numbers of enemies, and then, even when the spell ends, that's still 10d6 falling damage and falling prone. I mean, in those rare circumstances where there is a ceiling 100 feet up, then you can have them fall up, then drop concentration and have them fall back down, and they're going to take 20d6 damage and fall prone, potentially with no saving throw. This is also force movement, so there's the possibility of combining this with an effect maybe suspended above the enemies. So the biggest drawback of this spell is, as a druid, we have lower level spells that still really effectively deal with non-flying creatures without a saving throw. This spell also really effectively deals with non-flying creatures, and perhaps with them even more effectively, over a big area. So despite the possible redundancy of instance of use, I still think this deserves a purple rating. This is one I would definitely consider if we need that massive area. The next spell is Symbol. Over 1 minute, our druid casts a spell on a surface or object they can touch. A material component with a value of at least 1,000 gold pieces is consumed when we do this. When the spell is complete, a glyph appears on the object, or on a surface with up to a 10-foot diameter, and it remains until it's dispelled, or triggered, or until we move an object with the glyph more than 10 feet from where we cast the spell. When we cast a spell, we choose what triggers the glyph to go off. The exact parameters of what we can set as a trigger aren't specified. The examples they give are touching it, stepping on it, removing another object covering it, approaching within a certain distance of it, or manipulating an object that holds it. The trigger can also be refined to include creature types or physical characteristics such as height or weight. So presumably that gives us some kind of guidelines as to what the trigger can be. You can also set the glyph to not trigger against certain creatures or creatures that say a password you specify. If the glyph is triggered, it lights up to a 60-foot radius sphere with dim light for 10 minutes, and an effect you choose when you cast a spell affects all creatures in the area. It also affects any creature that enters the area or ends its turn there for that 10-minute duration of dim light. Now, the effects we choose from are devastating. There will be a saving throw, but we can choose from effects that target Constitution, Wisdom, Charisma, or Intelligence, and we can include effects like being stunned for a minute, falling unconscious for 10 minutes, or other similar debilitating effects, or we could cause 10d10 damage. So with effects like these in this massive area, surely I'm going to recommend this spell? Actually, no I won't. First, the casting time prevents this being used in combat, and the fixed location prevents it being used between most combats. And the cost of the material component is huge, 1,000 gold per casting. I mean, what this spell is supposed to do is clear enough. It's really not a combat spell or a spell for your druid. It's a spell for the NPC druid to create a nasty trap for you when you try to steal their stuff. I mean, you could use it to prevent your stuff from being stolen, but then you can't move that stuff. You could use it to protect your keep or your big tree home or something, but unless you happen to be there anyways, eventually the effects wear off and whomever broke in can continue whatever they were up to, and you're out the 1,000 gold piece material component. So this is red. If you're a DM, you might use this to create a challenge or a trap for your PCs, and it might be pretty nasty indeed. But the use here as a player character, it's just not worth it, frankly, for the cost. And in most campaigns, I just don't see value for selecting this. Our last spell is Whirlwind. Our druid casts a spell using their action and selects a point on the ground within 300 feet. For a duration of up to 1 minute, using our concentration, a 10-foot radius, 30-foot high cylinder whirlwind appears. Using our action for the duration of the spell, we can move the whirlwind up to 30 feet in any direction along the ground. Any objects of medium size or smaller in the spell's area that aren't secured or worn or carried are sucked up the whirlwind. If a creature starts their turn in the area or enters it for the first time on a turn, they make a dexterity saving throw. If they fail the dexterity saving throw, they take 10d6 bludgeoning damage. If they make it, half damage. If a creature fails their saving throw, and they are large size or smaller, then they need to make a strength saving throw. If they fail, they're restrained, and at the start of each of their turns, they're pulled 5 feet higher within the effect until they reach the top. If we move the whirlwind, any creatures restrained by it move with it, and there's no saving throw for that. If a creature restrained by the whirlwind uses their action, they can make a strength or dexterity check to free themselves. If they succeed, they're no longer restrained, but they are hurled by the whirlwind 3d6 times 10 feet away in a random direction, so probably about 100 feet. Once the spell ends, any creatures caught in the whirlwind immediately drop to the ground, potentially taking falling damage and falling prone, unless they have some method not to fall, such as a flying speed. So essentially, what we have here is a 10-foot radius effect that does damage, then we can move it around on our turn to do more damage, plus we can use force movement to push creatures into it, causing more damage, and creatures that remain in the effect take more damage. Then there's the chance to restrain, and a creature restrained is taking damage every turn, and escaping requires a check, not a saving throw, and it does use their action, and even if they succeed, they're still hurled at around 100 feet in a random direction. If we're inside, and assuming a ceiling of 30 feet above us or less, this is also an effect that works against flying creatures. So, as a druid, as I mentioned, we have some weakness there, so that's helpful for us. The downside here is restraining creatures with this is not easy, because they need to fail both a dexterity saving throw and a strength saving throw. Though we can potentially, and frankly fairly easily, force a creature that makes one of those saving throws make them again on the following round, and again if necessary later on. If a creature has legendary resistances, this could potentially eat those up fairly quickly. A creature restrained can be moved with our action with no saving throw, so we could also move them into areas that could cause more damage, or more status effects, or other nasty stuff. Overall, this is pretty decent, and this is the kind of thing I would expect from a 7th level spell. A consistent damage effect we can move that potentially also restrains targets. Against huge or larger creatures, it's just damage, so probably not our best bet, but against large or smaller creatures, it's a worthy cast for 7th level, and if there are huge or larger creatures in the mix, they're still taking damage. So we finish up with a purple spell. I don't think this is crazy powerful. I mean, you get 2 saving throws to avoid restrained, but the action to move and the effect has a lot of tactical value, and we're still causing regular damage. And that is our list of 7th level spells. And yeah, there are no blue spells at this level. Still, that's not to say we don't have any decent selections here. Spells like Plane Shift, Whirlwind, Reverse Gravity, and Mirage Arcane are still worthy of a 7th level slot. Maybe not the best 7th level spells in the game, but still a step up from what we could do until now. In the next part of this series, I'll highlight another level of spells that isn't quite a standout either, 8th level spells. But then we're going to finish up with the showstoppers after that. I hope you'll join me, and until then I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.